The call came just before dawn. At 4:57 a.m. on June 5th, 2020, the quiet of the Hanahan Dispatch Center was broken by a frantic voice on the line. 37-year-old Matthew Garrett Speck was speaking rapidly, almost gasping between words. He told the dispatcher that two men had forced their way into his home in the Eagle Landing neighborhood while he and his wife were asleep. According to him, the intruders opened fire. He said he tried to fight them off. He said they shot his wife. He said they stabbed him. The recording captured uneven breathing and long pauses, the sound of someone struggling to steady himself. Sirens were already on their way. But when officers arrived at the house minutes later, something felt wrong. The neighborhood was still wrapped in the heavy silence of early morning. Eagle Landing was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. Rows of clean suburban homes, trimmed lawns, and quiet streets. Officers approached the front door carefully. It was closed, locked. There were no broken windows, no shattered glass, no splintered frames. The house looked undisturbed, as if the night had passed peacefully. Inside, the scene was just as quiet. Wallets sat untouched on tables. Electronics remained exactly where they should have been. Drawers were closed, closets undisturbed. Nothing suggested that armed intruders had stormed through the house in a violent robbery, except for one room. Upstairs, in the bedroom, officers found Caitlin Speck, 33 years old, lying lifeless on the bed. On the rug beside the bed, in the spot where she usually slept, was the couple's chocolate Labrador, Bailey May. The dog was dead, too. Matthew Speck stood inside the house when officers reached him. His clothing was stained with blood. Shallow cuts marked his forearms and abdomen. He repeated the same story again and again. Two men broke in. There was a struggle. He chased them down the hallway before they escaped. But as detectives moved through the house, the story began to collapse almost immediately. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been broken. And every door and window was still locked. To understand how the story had truly begun, investigators would eventually have to rewind more than a decade, back to 2008, when Caitlin Conran first met Matthew Speck at a community event. Caitlin, born August 18, 1986, had built a quiet life around the two-story home in Eagle Landing. By 2020, she worked as a home-based interior designer, planning layouts, communicating with clients online, and turning her own house into a constantly evolving design project. The home meant more to her than simple property. It was her workspace, her sanctuary, and the place where she imagined her future unfolding. During long hours at her desk, Bailey May usually rested nearby, occasionally lifting her head whenever someone approached the door. The Labrador had become a constant presence in Caitlin's daily life. From the outside, Caitlin and Matthew's life appeared stable. They owned a home, planned renovations, and maintained the kind of routine typical of many suburban couples. But privately, things had begun to shift. Friends later recalled that Caitlin had started mentioning emotional distance in the marriage. Matthew was staying out later, avoiding serious conversations, and gradually withdrawing. It wasn't loud conflict. It was quieter than that, a slow drift. Yet Caitlin continued planning for the future, buying materials for renovations, organizing design projects, and filling her calendar with work. She never filed for divorce, never looked for another place to live. To her, Eagle Landing still felt safe. What she didn't know was that someone else inside the same house had begun looking at that life from a very different perspective. When detectives examined the crime scene more closely, one fact became impossible to ignore. If two armed intruders had truly broken in, they would have had to leave somehow. But the front door was secured from the inside with a deadbolt, a lock that could only be engaged from within the house. The windows were intact. No scratches marked the locks. No tool marks suggested forced entry. In reality, the house had been sealed. At the moment the shots were fired, investigators realized there had only been 3 living beings inside: Caitlin, Matthew, and Bailey May. At the hospital, doctors were reaching their own conclusions. Matthew claimed he had been wounded during a violent struggle, but his injuries told a different story. The cuts on his arms and abdomen were shallow and precise, with clean edges. They weren't chaotic wounds from a desperate fight. They were controlled. Medical experts described them as hesitation wounds, injuries commonly associated with self-infliction. There were no defensive cuts on his hands, no deep tissue damage, no signs that he had tried to block an attacker's knife. Even the blood on his clothing flowed downward in neat lines rather than the chaotic spray expected during a violent struggle. Meanwhile, another detail quietly dismantled the story of intruders: the dog. Ballistic analysis later showed that the bullet that killed Bailey May came from the same weapon used to kill Caitlin. The Labrador had been lying calmly at the foot of the bed when she was shot. Neighbors later confirmed something important. Bailey May barked at every stranger. Yet that night, no one heard barking, no warning, no alarm, which meant the person who entered the bedroom wasn't a stranger at all. It was someone the dog trusted. As investigators examined Matthew's phone and computer, they uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. In the days leading up to the murder, his search history had changed dramatically. How to stage a robbery. Lethal dose of cyanide. Gunshot wounds. Escape routes from the Eagle Landing neighborhood. The searches formed a digital blueprint of the very crime scene he had described. Messages to a former girlfriend revealed even more. In them, he described his marriage as a formality and hinted that he would take care of everything soon. Another colleague later testified that Matthew had asked detailed questions about property inheritance if a spouse suddenly died. Divorce would have been expensive, but death solved the problem instantly. During interrogation, detectives slowly laid out the evidence: the locked house, the medical findings, the ballistic reports, and the digital trail. One question hung in the air. If he chased the intruders out of the house, how did they lock the door behind them? Matthew had no answer. Investigators eventually reconstructed the night in full. After Caitlin fell asleep, Matthew retrieved a firearm he had prepared in advance. In the quiet bedroom, he shot his wife as she lay in bed. Then he shot the dog. Afterward, he staged the scene, carefully leaving valuables untouched. In the bathroom mirror, he used a knife to cut himself just enough to look a victim. Only then, after waiting for time to pass, did he call emergency services. Nearly 4 years later, in November 2024, the trial began in Berkeley County Court. For 5 days, prosecutors built their case piece by piece. Medical experts, ballistic specialists, digital analysts, each detail reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a home invasion. It was a planned murder. When the jury returned its verdict, Matthew Garrett Speck was found guilty on all counts: premeditated murder, animal cruelty, and weapons violations. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. The house in Eagle Landing, the asset at the center of his calculations, never became his reward. Under the law, a person cannot profit from a crime they commit. Instead, the property was transferred to Caitlin's family, and the story that began with a desperate phone call at dawn ended with a carefully dismantled lie, one exposed by locked doors, silent rooms, and the small details that refused to disappear.